So this PowerPoint is on the history of psychology, just gives us kind of a review of important people through the years who have developed psychology. This is just a quote from Sigmund Freud, who we'll talk a little bit more about later, but we know that he's probably one of the most popular figures of psychology. I'm sure you've all probably heard his name, and the quote says, "One day in retrospect, the years of struggle will strike you as the most beautiful." Freud really focused on how our past and our childhood influences us today, so I think that quote's very appropriate for him. The first person we'll look at is Wilhelm Wundt. He was actually the first person to be referred to as a psychologist, and he created the first laboratory for psychological research. He really believed in the practice of introspection. Just to define introspection, it's a reflective looking inward and examining your own thoughts and feelings. So he thought we should reflect, we should think about our own thoughts and feelings. And we know in psychology that our thoughts and our feelings and our behavior are all connected. So one affects the other. It's a cycle of affecting each other. So he said, well, you got to examine those. You got to examine how you think and feel. The next that came along were William James, John Dewey, and Charles Peirce. They believed in Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. They really focused on that. So let's define natural selection. It's a mechanism of evolution. It means that organisms that are more adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on the genes that aided their success. So the more we're able to survive and be adapted to our environment, we're more likely to live longer and we're more likely to reproduce. That's essentially the theory of evolution by natural selection. Well, these guys thought that this developed into the idea of functionalism, which solely focuses on how our mental activities help an organism fit into its environment. So they focused on what mental activities are going to help you survive and are going to help you live long enough to pass on your genes. Okay, now we're back to Sigmund Freud, who again is probably one of the most popular figures in psychology. He believed in psychoanalytic theory, which focuses on the role of a person's unconscious as well as early childhood experiences. And this particular perspective dominated clinical psychology for several decades. Again, from what I mentioned at first, he really focused on how our childhood affects us later. How does our childhood affect our behavior and thoughts and feelings as we become adults? He really thought that childhood had a huge impact. Next, we have Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler. They introduced the idea of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt theory emphasizes that we perceive things as a whole rather than its individual components. For example, just a simple example, a jigsaw puzzle. So instead of seeing each piece individually, we make meaningful connections between each piece to make a whole picture. To relate that to psychology, Gestalt would encourage psychologists to see a person as a whole rather than just a sum of individually measured parts. So when we look at people, we don't just look at this part and this thought and this feeling. We see them as a whole, and that's kind of what we'll discuss later, someone's personality, and that's what we look at as a whole, the whole person. The next figures are Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. They rejected Freud's concept of exploring the unconscious, and they said, we only need to measure, we only need to look at things we can observe. We don't need to look at the unconscious and what people are thinking and feeling. We can only measure what we observe. It's called behaviorism. It consists of observing behavior, and therefore you can change that behavior. And you can change it through reinforcement or punishment of that behavior. Reinforcement and punishment of a behavior is called operant conditioning. We'll discuss that later in class, and there will also be another PowerPoint that fully explains what operant conditioning is. So Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, they went a little bit further. They believed that human behavior shouldn't be reduced to just the unconscious which was Freud's idea, or observable behavior, which was Pavlov's and Skinner's idea. But he said you have to emphasize the potential for good, which is innate to all humans. This is called humanism. The triangle on the left is something he created. Um, he said first, before you can do anything else, you have to meet someone's physiological needs. They have to have food, they have to have water, they have to have a place to live, they need sufficient sleep. Once all those needs have been met, then the person needs to feel safe. They need to know that they're secure and safe in their environment. Once those needs have been met, so we've met the person's basic needs, they feel safe, then they can create intimate relationships and friends and focus on belonging to a social group. Once they've met that, then they can build their esteem. They need to have feelings of accomplishment and higher self-esteem. Once all four of those needs have been met, they can come to self-actualization, which they achieve their full potential. So he said we all have that potential. We all have the potential to reach self-actualization. We just have to meet those needs below it. Noam Chomsky was another influential person in psychology, specifically cognitive psychology, which we know cognitive is simply the way we think. That's that thoughts portion of thoughts, behavior, and emotions. He believed that it wasn't enough to focus on someone's observable behavior, but that their thoughts must also be taken into account. So he, unlike Skinner and Pavlov, said you can't just look at how they behave, you have to take into account their thoughts because that's intertwined with their behavior. And I love this quote by Chomsky says, if we are biological organisms, not angels, then our cognitive faculties are similar to those called physical capacities and should be studied much as other symptoms of the body are. In other words, we have to study the way we think just as much as we study our body and the physical capacities it has. Those are the main points, the main figures of psychology, the history of psychology. Thank you for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions.